Jerome Deroy is the CEO of Narativ, a company helping companies transform how people engage with work. And now, finally, a guest on Money Savage Maximize. Welcome, Jerome.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for
Yeah,
having me.
excited to have you on. Jerome, tell us a little bit about your personal life, some more about your work, and why you do what you do.
Sure. Personal life. I was born in France, and I grew up. I grew up there, and my mother is American. So then I moved to the U.S. But actually, before I moved to the U.S., I moved to Hong Kong to work there for a few years in a career in finance. And while I was there, I met someone who had been in the company for maybe 20, 25 years. I started with an internship before I got a job there. And really, she was the reason that I got a job in Hong Kong because I started out my career as an intern in Paris, France. And it was around the water cooler that I started having conversation with this veteran of the company who worked in every department. And she said, there's an opening in Hong Kong, and I think you should apply if you don't quite know what you're going to do next, which was the case. I didn't know what I was going to do next. So I followed her advice and I contacted the person, and indeed there was an opening, and I got the job. And at 23 years old, I landed in Hong Kong in December 1999,
Nice.
and that set me on this trajectory. And the reason I say that is because it links to why I do what I do. What that woman did at the water cooler there, she did what no one else did in that company in terms of onboarding me and transferring knowledge that she had about the company and how things worked there. And a lot of these conversations about knowledge, about successes, about challenges were happening around the water cooler. They weren't happening with leadership, between leadership and staff. There wasn't that kind of culture there. And so if I had not had that conversation, I wouldn't have known about that job. I wouldn't have known about, being able to kind of climb the corporate ladder, so to speak. And I wouldn't be even where I am now. And so I think about her a lot because that was more than 20 years ago. And, in subsequent jobs after that, usually what has always happened is that for the first couple of days, I'm looking at a compliance binder. I'm in a windowless conference room. I'm not being engaged really
Mm-hmm.
about who I am and what I want to do with my life and what do I want to do next? What's my 5-year vision for myself and my career? And as a result of that, I quit that job after 4 years and I completely reinvented myself and came to New York and started to work in film in a creative field. And that's how I met my business partner, Murray Nossel, who founded the company that I'm now the CEO of, Narrative. And we started working together to bring what his knowledge was around storytelling, really, and filmmaking. And we brought that to companies so that we could engage employees, not just, at a point when they're leaders, but right from their first day. And so that's really why I do what I do is to engage people and employees from the very first day that they start, not with a bunch of compliance issues. And don't get me wrong, you need to know about those compliance
Sure.
issues and you need to know to do those trainings, but you also need to inject the the human part of the company and the culture of the company there, because otherwise, how do you expect people to really get a sense of belonging and stay there? So that's why I do what I do.
I love it. It's the idea of start as you mean to go, right? And if you mean to go, shove somebody in a cubicle or a conference room with that aforementioned compliance binder. I can't imagine that's really what companies want, but that's just what they do.
Yes, yes, exactly. And it's really not a criticism of the people who have to do this because again, you have to do this and that's part of your job. And usually it's the HR function. That was the case for me. An HR person welcomed me very warmly and then sat me down in front of a training video that dated from the 80s, and that's supposed to give me a sense of how things work in that company. And it wasn't until a week later that I finally started to meet real human beings that were related to my job and what I had to do. So I think there's something that's blocking this transfer of knowledge between people in companies that's so critical. And too often you're getting the knowledge you need at the water cooler, but that's so informal that it's kind of a crapshoot. And so what we've created and what I've spent the last 10 years doing is really creating a system by which you can actually hear the stories you need to hear from the people in the company, not from some consultant or from the CEO, but people that are actually in your position who've been through what you've been through, telling you the stories of what it's like to work there, what's positive, what are the things they can improve on, what are you likely to encounter as challenges, so that you yourself know when you get into that situation, you'll remember that story that John told you about the time that he went through that. And as a result, you'll be much more prepared for it.
Yeah. Well, everything you just said makes perfect sense, right? But unless you're intentional about that, then you're just never going to do it, right? It's
Exactly,
not
exactly.
again to your point. It's not that the human resources team at XYZ company are lousy. In fact, they're probably excellent.
Yeah.
They just don't have the script.
That's right, exactly. And I think for me, where it starts is with leadership in companies. And even if you're a one man or a one woman show and it's your baby and you're creating it from the ground up, I think it really behooves everyone to start to listen, really. Because that's been my experience is there's a breakdown in listening really from the people who are the leaders of these companies. When you found a company, when you started, it's yours, and then it starts to grow. And now more people are coming in, and you really have to think about how do you want those people to see the same thing you saw when you started that company, the same thing you're seeing now as a leader. And so if you don't kind of collect and gather the stories that are needed to equip those new people to be able to, not only to be able to do their job, but also to really feel like they belong in this company. If you don't do that, then that's where things kind of fall down. But in order to do that, you have to start by listening, right? And you really have to start to listen to your own employees first, kind of put yourself in the background and just start to listen to what they're saying about your company. How do they feel about working in this company? What's challenging about their role right now? What are some of the successes that they're most proud of? Because from there, you'll be able to gather really critical information. Again, to me, this is all about transferring information that you wouldn't get otherwise, right? So as a leader, when you hear about those successes and those challenges, now you're like, wow, this is great. These are tools for me to bring this company into the future even further. And so I think for me, it always starts with listening, and it starts at the top where there needs to be an intention, like you said, it has to be very intentional. And then as a result, then now your HR group is actually empowered to put something in place. Because that's the other thing, is that too often HR people really want to do something about what I'm talking about engagement and about onboarding and making it more human and giving people a sense of belonging. But they get bogged down by the whole administration thing, administrative tasks. And if their leadership isn't like backing them 100% and pushing them towards that direction, then they're kind of speaking into a void.
Mm-hmm. So it's being able to successfully marry the important legal and compliance information with the humanizing experience of the founding story and the current story, and the right vehicle is through story, through narrative.
Yes, exactly. And I think, we kind of all know these stories, right? Of the two people in a garage, who started out, Microsoft, or who started out Apple,
Yeah.
and all these kinds of mythical stories, which are true stories. And everyone knows that story. You don't have to be an employee in those companies to know that story. They become like these legends, really. But then how does that kind of trickle down to the employee who 20, 30 years later is starting in that company? What's their story of the company? What's that narrative? And if you're not willing as a leader, a founder, or a manager of a team to start to listen to their stories, then you're liable to miss out on some of their best ideas, some of the best ideas that you could actually kind of leverage for your marketing and anything else, really. So yes, it starts with story, and I think and before storytelling, it has to start with listening, right? We have to put ourselves in that position of just being listeners, gather the stories, and then tell the stories we need to tell to the right audience, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that that all makes sense. So, do you have a sense of what that? I'm sure that you do. What what that framework really should
Mhm.
and can look like? Like,
Yeah.
is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a kind of a basic principle. So what we do at Narrative, the company, is that we have a kind of a methodology that underlies everything we do. So we got to onboarding and employee engagement through years and years and years of delivering this method of listening and storytelling to a variety of groups. At first it wasn't so much about employee engagement or onboarding. It was really about people being able to articulate exactly what it is that they do and why they do it. Exactly the question you asked me at the top of this show, right? And so we just gave them tools and a method to do a better job of that and to tell a story. And so to me, to answer your question, it's really about how do I do that? How do I listen in such a way that I'm going to get the best story out of someone? And then how do I tell the story of that I just heard in such a way that I'm going to move other people into action, whether that's my employees, whether that's my customers, or whether that's kind of the market that's out there, on social media, website, etc. And so to give you a sense of that, we hold that there's a reciprocal relationship between listening and telling. And so if you kind of think about, a glass of water and the shape of that glass of water. It's going to have different kinds of shapes depending on the glass. But essentially, what you're doing with that water is that the glass is giving the water its shape. And it's the same between listening and storytelling. Listening is giving the story its shape. So if I'm talking to you right now, if you weren't listening to me, or if I couldn't see you, et cetera, and or if you had to leave the room, or if something started to make a lot of noise in the background, I'd have to stop speaking because I wouldn't be sure of having your listening, right? So it's your listening that's actually kind of producing even what I'm saying. So we always start there. So the moment you become aware that, listening really matters, then you're not kind of steamrolling people with your message, and you're really paying attention to how people are listening to you and what they need. And you start to ask questions to people instead of just going right into your subject matter and your topic, just to make sure that we're on the same page. And then that's how you create trust and you start to listen to the story that the person has to tell you. Now, how do you tell that story afterwards? One basic principle without going through the whole thing. We have a book called Powered by Storytelling that people can find. It's by Marie Nossel, and it outlines our entire methodology. But I just want to give you one nugget about one of the things that makes a compelling story, if this is something that you want to take on for yourself, is that what makes a compelling story is really looking through the lens. It's as if you had a camera and you're looking through that lens and you're basically telling the story of what happened. That's the basic question we always ask, is what happened? And it's very distinct from what you thought about what happened, what your opinions were about what happened, what your judgments were about what happened, what your feelings were about what happened. So in a story, if I tell you a story about my own career, I'm never going to say, I went over to the water cooler and I was feeling kind of depressed and not passionate about my job, and I didn't know what to do with my life, right? That's not a story. The story is I went to, that's a bunch of things that are in my mind, and that I'm sharing with you for better or worse, but rather what I want to be doing if I'm telling you a story is just tell you what happened. So I got up from my desk and I walked over to the water cooler and I went to the coffee machine next to the water cooler. I poured myself a coffee. Then Brigitte came in, and Brigitte is 20 years older than me, and she takes out a cigarette. It's the 1990s in France, She takes out a cigarette and she starts smoking, and she asks me how I am. And then I get into the whole conversation, right? She said, I said, and then I end up in Hong Kong, right? But I'm never telling you anything about what I felt in the moment. Oh, I got excited. No, I'm not going to say anything. And the reason is that I don't want you to have the feelings that I'm imposing on you. I want you to have your own feelings about my story. And I want you to be triggered in a positive way by my story so that your experiences are triggered and some of your experiences around the related topic that I'm talking about are triggered. And that's how we create dialogue. That's how we create connection.
I love
That was
that.
a lot. I hope it makes
No,
sense.
it's great. I think I loved everything about that. I loved the pronunciation of Brigitte. Maybe, and what an amazing visual that popped into my head, right? And
Yeah.
you
Yes.
you allowed me to sort of paint my own picture based on the facts that you shared with me.
You got it.
Nice. As you're sharing all this, what also came into my head was how an organization can onboard new clients as well. Is that
Yes.
is that part of this process? And
Yeah, totally. We've seen. We worked with a client recently that told us that they were having an issue because they noticed that people were actually leaving at the onboarding stage because they weren't happy with the onboarding stage, and they went to another company that they felt had a better onboarding stage. So it helps with recruitment for sure. And then with clients themselves, I think once you enter into this process of listening, gathering stories, and telling the stories, those stories become your window to the world. We did some work with a big health insurance company, and they did this employee engagement initiative with us. And it was simply to work internally with people, and we gathered as many stories as possible. We gave them this methodology. We told them how to tell stories. We taught them that. And then they recorded some of those stories, the stories that best represented the values of the company. They then put them up on an internal channel. And it was one of their most engaging campaigns ever. They had hundreds of comments, thousands of people watched it, when usually there was a trickle of people who would watch this internal channel. And as a result of that, their advertising agency, who was looking at this and asking them about kind of doing an internal audit about what they had, they saw all these stories and they're like, wait a second, there's a story here that exactly fits our advertising campaign. Why don't we use that? And so I think that's where, a lot of times we sort of think about, we have to come up with some incredible idea, and let's go to this creative company and ask them to come up with that incredible idea. And that's what's going to bring us more clients. That's what's going to bring them on board, but rather inward and looked at your employees and the stories they tell, and that's your gold right there. And I think the more you can do that and put those stories out there via your website, your social media, your clients are actually going to understand you more. And I think that's one way you have of onboarding your clients.
I love it. It makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, Jerome, Savage Nation is ready for your difference making tip. What do you have for them?
Well, I'm definitely going to elaborate on one thing I said earlier. For me, it comes down to listening. And so what I encourage people to do is take any relationship that you're in, whether it's your spouse, your family, your boss, your employees, and come to them with an intentional, what I call intentional listening, right? And really look at them. And maybe this is someone that you've known for years and years and years and years, and you have all sorts of assumptions about who they are. And they're probably rooted in reality and something that happened. What if you actually set that aside? Look at that, set that aside, write down all your assumptions about that person, everything you know about them, and tell yourself, I'm going to listen to them differently today. I'm going to listen to them with an open mind and see what that does to that relationship. See what comes out of their mouth. Because usually we're not surprised by the people that we've known for a long time because we don't let them surprise us. We just kind of rush into what we have to say, and we're just anticipating when we're going to be able to speak next. Try to just set all of that aside. It's hard to do, but a tip to be able to do that is just write it all down. Write everything that's getting in your way, and before that meeting, then go into that meeting with an open mind and just let them speak. Maybe ask one question if they don't speak, but let them speak first. If you're someone who's used to speaking first, let everybody else speak first and see what you get from that.
Well, I think that is great stuff. That definitely gets a come on. Jerome, thank you so much for coming on. Where can Savage Nation learn more about you? How can people engage with Narativ?
So there's a book that's out there called Powered by Storytelling, and it's by Narrative's founder, Murray Nossel. That's Nossel. And you can find it anywhere you find books, including on Amazon. And you can also find more about our company, narativ.com. That's Narativ.com. So just one R, no E, narativ.com. And then I also want to point people to my LinkedIn page. It's Jerome Deroy, Jeromederoy. And that's where you'll find an article that I wrote about the water cooler, about the value of the water cooler, and how we've actually lost it in this pandemic in many cases, because we're no longer going into physical spaces, or haven't for a long time. And so how to replace that. So you'll find that article. It's called The Value of the Water Cooler and How to Replace It. So those are the three ways that you can get in touch with us.
Excellent. Well, Savage Nation, if you enjoyed this as much as I did, show Jerome your appreciation and share today's show with a friend who also appreciates good ideas. Pick up a copy of Powered by Storytelling. Go to narativ.com. That's Narativ.com. And then find Jerome Deroy on LinkedIn and check out the article about how to reclaim, rediscover the water cooler in the age of COVID. Thanks again, Jerome.
Thank you, George. Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah.
Loved it.
And until next time, keep fighting the good fight, because we are all in this together.